Skin Deep, written and narrated by Saffron Bryant. Chapter 4. Outside of the city limits, the sun beat down on Ravyn's skin, heat searing off the road and encasing her in what felt like a bed of coals. Her skin stung under the onslaught and glowed red. Her head pounded and she longed for water, but of all the things she'd packed, she hadn't thought of that. Her only relief came from the wind whipping across her skin as she rode through the harsh desert. The black mask clung to her face in a layer of sweat, trapping heat and slowly suffocating her. She lifted it, intending to hurl it to the side of the road when a flurry of sand plowed into her face, stinging like a cloud of needles. She dropped the mask back into place, thankful that none of the sand had hit her eyes. She glanced over her shoulder. The city had shrunk to a dull speck on the horizon, and there were no sounds of pursuit. Letting the bike slow, she guided it to the side of the road and threw her leg over the side. The engine cut out, and she fell forward onto the handlebars, pushing the mask up and gasping for air. She let her shoe drop to the ground and shoved her bare foot back inside, flexing her aching knuckles. Squinting into the distance, she pulled her bag over her shoulder and opened it wide. She flung the undesirable mask inside and pulled out a pair of dark glasses that she slipped over her stinging eyes. The dried blood from her wounded leg formed a red crust that stuck her jeans to her flesh. Without medical supplies, she didn't dare try to examine it, so she pulled out a spare shirt and tied it over her thigh, wincing as the pressure sent a jolt of pain up her leg. She swallowed, her dry throat a reminder that without water she wouldn't last long in the harsh desert. Her cracked lips stung as she ran her tongue over them. She rolled her neck, took a deep breath, tossed her bag over her shoulder, and flicked the ignition wires together. The bike roared and leapt forward. She ignored the aching pain creeping up her spine and spreading through her back. For the next hour, desert rushed by on either side, interspersed with stunted trees. Every few minutes she glanced over her shoulder, sure she felt eyes on her back, but every time the road behind lay empty. No vehicles passed until she reached the first settlement. Red brick houses sprouted out of the ground like warts, crowding around a black mine shaft. A man in a white singlet stood next to a fuel pump beneath the shade of an awning. He glanced up at Ravyn and raised an eyebrow as she shot past. A deep rumble made her glance up. A tanker rumbled up the road towards her, going in the opposite direction. Its broad shadow fell across her skin and for a moment blocked the harsh sun. She ducked her head low, hiding as much of her face as was possible. Limited travel between the capital and the outer settlements didn't mean that they hadn't heard about the 10,000 gold reward. She didn't stop, and in a mere minute shot out of the other side of the settlement and back into the red desert. Biting her lip, she looked at the fuel gauge. Half a tank to go. The rest of the day passed in the same way. Hours of desert peppered with the occasional settlement. She ached to stop, to rest and find water, but each time a prickle spread across her neck and she pushed the throttle harder, sure that capture lurked in every shadow. By mid-afternoon, her head had become an aching ball of fire. It pounded in time with her heartbeat while sharp pangs of agony spiraled around her temples. Her eyes stung in the glare of the setting sun, and her heavy lids hung low, aching to drop closed. The heat swirling off the desert created shiny patterns in the air that she couldn't help but watch. They danced across the red dirt, chasing each other, and she gaped at them, the bike swerving across the road. The hours dragged on until she could barely feel her legs. She'd lost every sense of what she was doing except that she had to keep riding. Her ears rung as a glitter on the horizon warned of a coming settlement. She took a deep breath, the air rasping against her parched throat and stars dancing across her vision. The road blurred past beneath her feet as she pushed the throttle. The engine sputtered beneath her, choking. She glanced at the fuel gauge. It fell in and out of focus from her stinging eyes, but she couldn't ignore the glaring, empty light. Her head dipped and she lost consciousness, blackness dropping over her eyes like a shroud. She gasped and looked up, veering away from the side of the road. The bike rumbled and screeched. She tried to focus, but her eyelids flickered, out of her control. The engine shuddered and the bike swerved, Her stomach dropped as the bike fell away beneath her, and then there was blackness. "That's 10,000 pieces of gold we've got lying on our table." "She's my patient, not your piggy bank." "She sure is pretty." Ravyn kept her eyes closed and her breathing steady as the voices filtered through her waking mind. Her last memories lay jumbled together like a pile of abandoned cars, rusted and useless. She'd been riding, escaping the city. It had been hot. Then she'd lost control of the bike. She couldn't remember anything after that. Her heart fluttered as she imagined the horror that would greet her when she opened her eyes. The voices crowded around her, at least 5 of them, overlaid with a low hum that reminded Ravyn of a rumbling engine. "Well, you know she's just gonna..." "Shh, I think she's awake." Ravyn's heart skipped and her eyes flew open. Her gaze locked onto a smooth metal face with 2 camera lens eyes leaning over her. The metal had been shaped around the eyes and mouth to look like glasses and a beard. Her mouth dropped open. "You're a robot." "Great, she's clever too." Ravyn turned to follow the sarcastic voice on her other side. Another robot towered over her, although his broad shoulders stretched at least 4 times the width of hers. "Ignore him," said the first robot, drawing her gaze. "We call him Grumpy. I'm Doc." Ravyn's head spun as she pushed herself into a sitting position. Doc helped, settling her back against a solid metal wall. Everywhere she looked seemed to be made of metal, from the smooth table she sat on, to the benches, to the ceiling. "Quite a nasty fall you had. Lucky it was outside our house and nowhere else," Doc said. Ravyn blinked and tried to focus on his kindly face. "Thank you?" Doc smiled and patted her arm. "Not a trouble." Grumpy stepped closer to the table so that his shoulders blocked most of the overhead light. "What are you doing here?" Ravyn swallowed and glanced at the door. "Nothing, just traveling." Grumpy snorted and folded his thick, square arms across his equally square chest. "And what's Ravyn Alden doing out here when she's supposed to be parading the capital?" Ravyn took a deep breath and swung her legs over the side of the table towards Doc. She ignored the pain in her leg and vaulted off the table, stumbling towards the front door, head pounding with each step. "Whoa!" Grumpy's hand stuck out and snatched hold of her shirt, ripping her back so that she sat down with a thud. Sharp pain shot up Ravyn's leg and she bit her lip. She glanced down to see a jagged cut running up her thigh. Broad stitches weaved in and out of her flesh, holding the flaps of skin together. "Be gentle," Doc said, leaning over Ravyn's leg and checking the stitches. "Don't terrify the girl." "Don't worry, dear. We're not here to turn you in." Grumpy kicked the ground at his feet. "According to some of us," he mumbled. Doc glanced over his shoulder and glared at Grumpy before turning to face Ravyn. Intricate machinery controlled his facial plates so that the expressions were almost human. The gears below his ears squeaked and his mouth stretched into a smile. "Ignore him." Ravyn nodded, still ready to run at the first chance she got. She opened her mouth to speak when a light voice filled the air with a cheerful song, like a bird at first light. The sound drifted through the house, filling it. "Great, he's back," said Grumpy, humping his shoulders and stepping back against the wall. "Good morning, residents," a bright voice said, booming like a commentator at the annual races. Ravyn jumped, head turning in search of the voice. "Sorry for the delay, but the news is positively racing this morning. My circuits are just jumping with excitement. In fact, Get to the point, you annoying bastard," yelled Grumpy, thumping his fist into the closest wall. "Well, somebody needs to get back to bed and get up on the right side," the voice bubbled on, undeterred. "That's Happy," Doc said. "Household and personal property intelligence. He looks after things around here. And is generally a pain in the ass. It looks like we're in for another gloriously warm day with temperatures set to hit over 40 degrees Celsius. Perfect for working on that tan." Doc rolled his eyes. Get to the point, Happy. The news. Yes, sir, I'd be glad to. The news is on fire with rumors about Ravyn Alden. The royal escorts are searching the country for her as we speak, and the bounty has gone up to 15,000 gold. I'm sure that's enough to make even Grumpy crack a smile. Grumpy's arms dropped to his side. 15,000? Do you know what we could do with 15,000? Happy, call the escorts. No, Doc glared at Grumpy. Don't call anyone. We're not turning her over. Curse your bleeding heart. With 15,000 gold, we could do nothing. You of all people know that as robots we wouldn't be eligible for payment. But... Doc put his hands on his hips. But nothing. She's our guest, and you'll treat her with the respect she deserves. Doc turned to Ravyn and opened his mouth, but before he could talk, the lights flickered off, leaving the small house lit only by a few shafts of sunlight piercing through the window. Happy's voice bubbled from the shadows. Another power outage. By my calculations, that puts us at 10 for this month. That's got to be a new record. Lights and non-essential systems are offline. Doc sighed. How long, Happy? Just a jiffy. As soon as Happy stopped talking, the lights blinked on. Something caught Ravyn's eye next to the far counter, but it disappeared so fast that she thought she'd imagined it. Doc followed her gaze. He grunted and took a step towards the counter. Bashful, get out from behind there and introduce yourself properly. Something clicked behind the counter but stayed out of sight. Doc reached over the bench and hauled something over the top. To Ravyn, it looked like a small cube with arms flailing at the sides. A digital display screen filled its face, displaying 2 wide eyes and red pixels glowing where its cheeks would have been. It squeaked and swatted at Doc's hands as the taller robot strode back to Ravyn's side. This is Bashful. He'll probably trip you up 20 times a day, Grumpy added. The red pixels on Bashful's face glowed brighter. Nice to meet you, said Ravyn. Bashful squeaked and Doc put him back on the floor where he scurried out of sight behind another bench. Doc frowned and looked out of the window. That just leaves... The front door flew open and a thin robot rolled in on a single wheel, 2 telescopic eyes zooming in towards Ravyn's face. Black fluid dribbled out of the robot's base and dripped to the floor, making an oily puddle. Leaky, finished Doc. Ravyn sunk back against the wall, shoulders hunched. She may have made it out of the city, but she seemed to have ended up in some kind of robot asylum. Her spine tingled, urging her to run, but the jagged gash in her leg reminded her that she wasn't going anywhere. End chapter. Make sure to like and subscribe so that you'll know when the next chapter is released.